Oh my goodness, I am so excited to be here. Is anybody at Abstractions for the first time? Okay, that is like the majority of the room. There might be like 6 of you who are not here for the first time. That's awesome. I'm pretty pumped to be here. It's also my first time in Pittsburgh, which is kind of neat. Are there any Pittsburgh locals in the room? You have, whoa, okay, this is overwhelming. Got it. You have a beautiful city. I'm going to make sure to talk very nicely about Pittsburgh for the entirety of my talk now. Let's get started. My name is Amy Gebhardt. I always like to start my talks with an introduction slide. It really serves as a disclaimer slide, however, because I think when any speaker at a conference like this is going to get up here and give you any sort of generic, general advice about something, I think it's really important that you understand where they're coming from. Things that are instinctual to me and maybe even easy for me may not at all be instinctual for you or easy for you or instinctual or easy for a member of your team. So this slide here is going to mostly serve as a disclaimer. The first bit is my Twitter handle. I like Twitter. That's not a disclaimer. I just like Twitter. It's some weird deviation of my name and my maiden name, and it's confusing, but here we are. All right, it's the brand now. I am the lead front-end software engineer at a company called Sports Engine. Have any of you heard of Sports Engine? There are some aggressive hands in the room, so that's exciting, but not very many. Not very many hands, not just the aggressive ones. Sports Engine is a medium-ish company based out of Minneapolis. We build software for youth sports. As the lead front-end software engineer there, I lead our front-end engineering at Sports Engine, from architecture and infrastructure decisions to actually having about a team of 12 who report to me directly. This means I review code pretty much every single day. I'm getting to a point now where I'm writing a little bit less code. Awkward transition if anybody ever wants to talk about that, but that's a whole other talk for a different day. I am having my code reviewed a little less as a result, but any code I do write is reviewed 100% of the time, kind of like code reviews. The other thing I like to share with folks as a disclaimer is that I grew up in Maine, lived outside of Boston for a few years before moving to Minneapolis. And I like to share this specifically with this talk because of where I've lived. I've encountered a lot of different communication styles. Right? Yeah, any New England natives? Yeah, nice. So our communication style is aggressive, I would say, pretty direct. I come from a pretty large Italian family. We never guess how somebody is feeling. And then I married a native Minnesotan, like so native Minnesotan, grew up on a farm. My joke is that he had a feeling once and his parents told him to put it away. Kind of a thing. So encountered many different communication styles. The important piece here is that what's instinctual for me may not be an effective form of communication for the person I'm trying to interact with. Very important when you're thinking about code reviews. And finally, I like to tell folks what my Myers-Briggs is. Are there any other ENFJs in the room? This is the first time that's ever happened. Yeah, they're actively trying to keep us out of the industry, I think. So we have to work hard. There are 2 things I want to tell you about ENFJs and why it's relevant for this talk. So that first letter there, E, does anybody know what that stands for? Extrovert, that's right. So when I first took this, I was a 30 out of 30. I was a 100% extrovert. I took it again recently and I'm only 98% now, so it simmered down a little bit. I need to find ways, especially in this industry, in this career, to create more of a social aspect to it. I need to find other ways to interact with humans. So of course I'm like, code, humans, code reviews. Let's do code reviews all the time and talk about code. It's very overwhelming for the introverts I work with. The other thing I want to tell you about ENFJs is that we crave feedback. Any kind of feedback. We get discouraged without it. So even if it is a Post-it note on my desk that says, you suck, don't do that. That's not a great way to get feedback. But even that is something that an ENFJ is like, yes. I know Myers-Briggs is probably as useful as like a which latte are you, but I have found those 2 pieces to be actually pretty useful. All right, let's talk about code reviews. How many of you have ever participated in a code review? Has it ever felt like this? Yeah, so I come from a pretty traditional computer science background, And we didn't learn any version control or web technologies, but we did code reviews. And it was in a setting really similar to this, where we had a student actually put their code up on a screen, and we had all the other students in the room sit around and look at the code. It was whatever code could fit on the screen, and it was the first time the other students in the room were even seeing that code. And we were being graded on how we received feedback and the kind of feedback we gave. That is a horrendous way to do code reviews, even for an extrovert who loves feedback. That's not a great way to approach that. So my very first job out of college, we didn't do code reviews at all. We were a super small company, less than 20 people. I think at the biggest, our dev team was 8 people. I went to a conference, and I went to a talk on code reviews, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the thing I've been looking for. I'm so excited. We should go back to the office. We should start doing these code reviews. And I came in all excited to go. It's a little dark on here, and that was pretty much my experience. So this GIF here, does anybody know what movie this is from? Oh, yeah, it's a favorite. I came in determined, and I was like, yes, code reviews are brilliant, where they were going to give us so much benefit. And I walked into my team, and I was like, let's start doing them. And it was literally like I fell through the cracks. And it was unsuccessful pretty much immediately at the company I worked at, even with such a small dev team that knew each other very well and trusted each other a lot. At the time, I was also kind of interested in conferences. Extrovert, makes sense. And somebody gave me some advice to write the abstract of the talk I wished to attend, which is really great advice for getting a talk accepted at a conference. But then you might actually get it accepted, and then you have to talk about something you know nothing about. So what you're about to see is a talk that I wrote about 5 years ago now, actually. And it was the talk I wish I had attended on code reviews. I've changed this talk a lot in those 5 years, being on different teams and having different experiences. But that's what we're going to do. Are you ready? Yeah. All right. Anybody need more coffee? No? I definitely don't. All right. What are code reviews? Why are they useful? I'm really big on terminology. I like to be on the same page about things. So let's just take a very brief second to define what this is. This is the part in the software development process where a human reviews another human's code. Yeah? Code review, cool, on the same page. Software is written by humans, humans make mistakes, and by the transitive property, then software has mistakes. We learned about that in the keynote this morning, right? But we're always looking for ways to discover the mistakes that we've written in our code. I'm not going to spend much time today convincing you that code reviews are a good idea. That's most of the code review talks that I feel like you go to are people trying to convince you that this is worth it. We're going to do a very brief infomercial on code reviews. I grew up in an infomercial family. We had all those ads seen on TV, devices. There have been like 6 new waves in my house. So be on a code review infomercial journey with me. Whew. So infomercials usually start with the black and white, right? Like some ridiculous scenario. I want you to picture the most horrific code review experience that you can imagine. Maybe, I hope not, maybe you've even experienced this in real life, but it's in black and white, it's ridiculous, it's chaotic. Maybe you have a principal software engineer that you just adore and deeply respect and want to be when you grow up, and he responds to your code with LOL what? That actually happened to me. And it's like, that's my black and white code review moment. Are you ready for the colorful version? Here's what you get when code reviews are actually effective. You get to catch mistakes in the least costly of development times, right? This is before your QA engineer finds your error. This is before your UX designer. And definitely before your user is going to find this error. That's a good thing. You get to ensure the team is held accountable to quality standards and expectations, create some alignment around your team. You get to share domain knowledge across your entire team. Maybe you have a whole bunch of different code bases that it's rare for one engineer to work in most of them consistently. This is a great way for them to get familiar with other code bases. You get to provide these really organic opportunities to learn, mentor, and teach. But wait, there's more. This is the cheesiest of them all, but it's probably my favorite part. I really do think that effective code reviews are going to build a stronger foundation of trust among your engineers. Full of win, right? Code reviews are good. Can we move on from that? If you don't believe me, there are lots of studies out there that have even measured the effectiveness of code reviews for finding mistakes. They're pretty effective. There's even one study that argues that it's 33% more effective for finding faults in your software than standard unit testing, which is wild because of how much time we spend unit testing. Okay, cool. We want to do code reviews? Now what? What are we actually going to be reviewing? Code rate for bugs? Yeah, it's funny. Got to have a couple cat gifs in here. Found the bug, ate it. No. Oh, okay, all right. I'll save my programming jokes then. The groan. All right, let's talk about what you should actually be reviewing. Code you did not work on. Generally, if you're going to be reviewing code as the code reviewer, it won't count if you're the author of the code as well. It doesn't mean that reviewing your own code is a bad idea. Oftentimes when I create a pull request before I ask any other engineer for a code review, I will do my own code review on it. It's very rare that there isn't at least 1 to 3 new commits after I spend the time to review my own code. You're looking at 200 to 400 lines of code to be the most effective when looking for code reviews, which if you think of some pull requests that you may have reviewed yourself, sometimes those are 4,000 lines of code. Yeah, I know I had one of those just come up in the last couple of weeks and it hurt. I think my comment was I reviewed it, but I reviewed 4,000 lines of code, so I am not confident in my ability to effectively do a code review when it's this size. Yeah. If you do have some really large amount of code that you should be reviewing, try to time box it to an hour. Give yourself a break and revisit the code. Your ability to find these, again, your effectiveness is going to go down pretty significantly. This is a beautiful ideal scenario. This is rarely real life, so finding ways to adjust your practice and your habits based on your real life situations. When you have a 4,000 code line change pull request, how are you going to go about that? All right, what should you be looking for? I think we've got 4 big categories here. We'll talk about these individually, but I think if I could break it down, correctness, clarity, efficiency, and style are the big ones that I like to focus on. The first being correctness. Does it do what it's supposed to do? Think about things like off by 1 errors, copy and paste and spelling errors, copy pasta. That's a thing that people say, right? Yeah, okay. Edge cases and exception handling, data validation, security, internationalization, and accessibility could probably each be their own category. At Sports Engine, for us, there are certain things that we're always looking for in these 3 major categories that you could break down further. But depending on where you're at, the things that you're focused on as a team, these may be like, you might not have to worry about internationalization at the moment, but those are things that we absolutely need to worry about. Clarity and maintainability. This is a very controversial one, of course. What looks maintainable to me is probably pretty different than what looks maintainable to somebody else. The way that I like to test clarity and maintainability is to have somebody other than the author describe what the code is doing. If they can, like, in plain language, not in pseudocode even, describe what's happening, that's a pretty good sign that this code is clear and hopefully then as a result more maintainable. Think about things like self-documenting naming conventions, function length and purpose, file length and purpose, ternary operators, guard clauses. You could arguably say that those might fall under style, perhaps, but I think they also fall under clarity and maintainability. The nice thing about code reviews, you and your team get to make up the rules. You and your team get to make up what clear code looks like. You get to decide what that is. Efficiency. So it's pretty straightforward. What's the performance impact? Some sneaky things, or some obvious things are probably like database queries and DOM manipulation, asynchronous JavaScript. Are there a bunch of async calls you could be making all at once instead of waiting for each of them to finish? If you're utilizing an ORM, with great power comes great responsibility. If you are bringing in a giant library to use one method, maybe you don't need the whole giant library, and there are ways to make this a little bit more perform. Style. Now this is probably the most controversial for an actual code review, but does this code that you're looking at meet your style standards? Hint, you should have style standards. This should be a thing. Kind of one of your goals is to make it look like you can't tell who wrote the code. You can't tell by looking at it that Shane wrote this one, or Oliver wrote that one, or Amy wrote this one. It should be pretty ambiguous without looking at the version control history. Think about comments, line length, again, naming conventions, even indentation. My big piece of advice here, though, is to not spend your time manually reviewing what automated tools can find. We have linters that can do most of this. Have any of you heard of Code Climate? Yeah, did anybody use Code Climate like a long time ago and really dislike it? Yeah, it's much better now. We just started using it again just in the last year. And their maintainability checks, it's basically an automated code review tool that you can configure in different ways. That's something that we've implemented that really helps our code review process as well. You can do that with unit test coverage. There's no need for you to be like, hey, you're missing a semicolon, or let's see. You don't have to have the tabs versus spaces conversation again. Okay, side note. We are anti-semicolon in JavaScript at Sports Engine. Who is team semicolon? My people, yes. I've gotten used to it, but that's one of those things that there's no reason to keep having that discussion. At some point, it was decided that we weren't going to use semicolons in our JavaScript or TypeScript. I know it hurts me every day, but there's no reason to spend energy on it, and we have these automated tools to call those things out. All right, who should be involved in code reviews? You can really keep the number small. At one company I worked at, one process we had was to have our entire, all of the engineers on a particular team sitting in a room to review some of the code, which was great if we had things that we wanted to debate or discuss. We had equal voices. Everybody was there to discuss things. But really, I don't know that we got a whole ton of value out of the code review itself by doing that. Don't be afraid to review code you aren't familiar with. I've reviewed code in a language I don't know. You can actually add this really great value because you have this fresh perspective on a code review. Maybe that's not the only code review you want to get. If somebody has never written in this language or been in this code base, it might be worthwhile to get somebody else as well to review that same code. But don't hesitate to do that. On a similar note, make sure you're encouraging your juniors to review your seniors. I don't love the term junior, but I think we all kind of know what I mean. An early entry career or somebody with less experience, make sure they're reviewing senior engineers' code as well as vice versa. Don't limit who can review just based on their experience. At Sports Engine, this one is really important to us, but one thing that we use as well is labels on our pull requests. So if something is considered high risk, we have a subset of engineers who also need to review that code. But it really does empower our early career engineers to review code as well and feel confident in that. All right, when should we do reviews? All the time? That's pair programming. This is where I'd make my pair programming joke, but you hurt me earlier, so it's not going to happen. Every commit, that would be a lot. Every branch merge or pull request, spontaneous unscheduled reviews, weekly, maybe in a cadence along with your sprint reviews. I've done some combination of all of these, except for every commit. That's a lot. At Sports Engine, we do it 100% of our pull requests. They cannot be merged until they have code review sign-off. We also have a really delightful, like, star eye emoji continuous deployment process, and we push to production probably 60, 70 times a day. So actually having these code reviews on every single PR is really, really important to that whole process and keeping everything from burning down, which it doesn't, and I still don't understand why. I really love spontaneous and unscheduled code reviews. That's some of my favorites. If I'm like working on something and I feel like I'm not done yet, but I really want to get some eyes on it and get some feedback already initially, I will just take up my computer and go walk up to somebody and have them sit down and read it with me. More human interaction. I was on a team where we did code reviews for basically each story. So depending on, you could have multiple pull requests for a story at this place. And we would have reviews happen online, digitally, throughout the sprint. But then in person, we'd gather once a week, or once per sprint, to talk about the comments on those actual code reviews together as a group, which was a very different way of doing code reviews. It was actually some of my favorite ways of doing code reviews. I don't think it scales very well, but it was nice on a really small team where we were releasing once a sprint versus many, many times a day. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that, though. The big thing is making sure that code reviews are really part of your culture. If you can achieve this part where somebody's like, well, I don't push code unless it's been reviewed. I don't merge code or release code unless it's been reviewed. If that's part of your thought process, then code reviews will happen whenever they should happen. You don't necessarily have to put it at a certain point in your process then. If you treat it like unit testing or QA or even just a refactoring step, if it's part of how you write code, it's going to happen. Okay, how should reviews happen? This is on the more practical side of things, right? One-on-one, online, using an online tool. I have a lot of opinions about this as an extrovert, I'm sure you can imagine. Obviously, at Sports Engine, if we're doing it on a per pull request basis, we likely are doing it online. We are. I've been on teams that do a combination of online and in-person code review. I've done just in-person code review, putting it on a projector and having folks read it. I think there's something to online reviews just from a practical standpoint. Logistically, that's much easier to go through. I like the idea of having a record of the interaction around the code review. If there's a discussion about maybe a gray area or somebody didn't know what decision to make, there's a record there where we can see it. It allows us to own our words a little bit and the way that we communicate with each other, again, because there's a record. But online is really tricky also to understand what somebody's tone or intent is as well. And that can be a little bit trickier with trying to create a really positive dynamic or a positive experience for your engineers. Especially if you're somebody who doesn't know the person reviewing your code super well, it's hard to sometimes pick up on some of the nuances just online. In-person's real fun, right? I like the idea of actually being able to have a face-to-face interaction with somebody and talk about the code. Body language has a significant impact on the way that we interpret things. I think there's a lot more. The human aspect is very important in code reviews and receiving feedback in general. And I think the in-person part can help with that a lot. It's also really uncomfortable for people sometimes to do in person. Again, a thing that's instinctual and awesome for me may not be instinctual and awesome for you. I do like the idea, oftentimes if I'm reviewing somebody's code online and I feel like I have a bigger explanation, I will go have a conversation with them in person and discuss it with them, especially if I think maybe it's not going to be received super well. I'll try to do that in person. But then I always go back and follow up on the pull request online itself and recap or summarize the discussion that we had so that record is again there. How you go about this is really up to your team. You're going to have different personalities, dynamics. Try different things, experiment, find what's effective for you, and go with it. It doesn't have to be a standard that everybody else has. There's a handful of online tools. I've used Crucible in the past. That's part of the Atlassian suite. I loved it. One thing that I really liked about Crucible was that it was really easy to pick different commits or pull requests or branches from a variety of different repos, and you could pull that into a single code review. So because we had stories that would cross multiple repos, this was a really nice way to be like, the code review for this story is this, and it was a single piece. It was also a really easy way to do quick code snippets that weren't tied to a repo, but you just wanted to get some feedback in. The interface was really great for getting feedback on that. We also experimented, that same team, with Upsource by JetBrains. Didn't end up going with that. We went with Crucible instead, but it was pretty cool. And then there's something about pull requests or merge requests, right, on GitHub or Bitbucket. That's pretty seamless and easy to use. That's what we do now. I don't have a whole ton of complaints around that process. Now you're good, right? We know how to do code reviews? No, we're still here. I really think that we're still here. And I've got a story about why. So we've got this, right? Can you all see this okay? We've got a WTFs per minute, and that's how you can tell if your code is good. or not great. If it's not great code, there's a lot of WTF moments. That's not great. I hope that that's not people's reactions when they're looking at your code. I've talked a lot about Sports Engine, and I'm really proud of a lot of things that we do at Sports Engine. Yeah, you're already giggling. You can tell the timestamp. This is August of last year. This is just a year ago. We're still working on things. All right, so let's see. The blue box at the top here is the original reviewer of the code. And this individual jumps in and says, can this be broken up so that it's more readable? Now, if you notice up there, we have variables like AO and BO. We have a double ternary operator on this line. I think that this person reviewing, this reviewer, has made a very reasonable request here. But then we get Orange in here. Orange is the author of this code. And Orange says, in all lowercase with a period, I don't want to. Yes, right. Now, a purple person swoops in here, and purple says, for what it's worth, I had the same thought as the original reviewer of this blue person. This is certainly not a hill worth dying on, however, which pause implies that there are hills worth dying on when it comes to code reviews, but that's okay. As the author, I think you get to make the final call. Do you think this code is in production today? It is. This is my perfect lol sob moment where I just find these interactions hilarious and deeply troubling. The way that we interact with each other really, really matters, and that's the rest that we're going to focus on today. So those soft skills, as part of this, we can talk about what you should be looking for, clarity and maintainability. We can talk about security and internationalization. But really, when it comes to making code reviews effective, it's about this part. It's about the soft skills. So you avoid those I don't want to moments. Again, have that style guide. Decide what's important and stop wasting your time on what's not, which is why I don't fight about semicolons. I bring it up subtly every time I talk about code reviews, but I don't actually have fights anymore about it. Avoid general feedback. It sucks always. That's funny because that's chatting. Yeah, okay, all right. It's there. This is also really good advice for romantic relationships. As a side note, don't do the whole general feedback thing. We've got our sad panda here. These are real examples from code reviews that I have been part of in some way for general negative feedback. This is messy. This is problematic, right? Because if I'm an early career engineer, or even if I'm just brand new to a team, and somebody reviews my code and says, this is messy, I have no idea what about it is messy, if they're just leaving it right at that. LOL, what? Ugh, this was a real one. This one really hurt me. That was my code. You never want to append in a loop. Why is this one falling under general negative? Doesn't explain why. It's also using the word never, which is pretty tricky. Again, great advice for romantic relationships. Avoid those absolutes. General positive feedback also makes us feel like sad parrot, though, because for very similar reasons. This looks great. Yay! I don't know why you think this looks great. Can you give me some specifics around this? Yay! That's a real one. And of course, party parrot was just a description once. Sometimes these, if there's a very specific context, maybe these are going to be sufficient, but likely that's not the case. And if it's something that you and maybe the author understand well, that's great. But again, you're trying to make this a record, especially if this is happening on an online tool, for future engineers to be able to reference this. Help them understand why this made you feel like a party parrot. So specific negative feedback might be something like promise void instead of promise any. This could be picked up by a linter, but that's okay. Could we pull this interface out into its own file so that we can follow our single responsibility commitment? Very specific. It's also giving the author the opportunity to make a decision here. Maybe there's a reason why they didn't want to do that, instead of assuming that they just forgot or didn't care about the single responsibility. Specific positive feedback is also happy. Nice job naming these. Very easy to read. What's really fun is that the person who wrote this was also the same person who was reviewing the I don't want to comment and was asking for that. So there are times where that's good. Additional describe blocks really help organize our tests. Make sense? Okay, this is not actually supposed to be readable, but I think this is some very specific feedback. If you can see, it was very hard to get a screenshot of this. This is a long explanation about type assertion and why we were doing something a certain way. The part that I really like is the response was, now catch your breath, for the detailed explanation. I definitely encourage you to add additional links to articles, especially if you're bringing up something maybe a little bit more controversial. Maybe there's a different way that somebody else has articulated it that might make more sense to the author or to the reviewer, whoever it is. You can also share working code snippets. You don't have to make your code review comments just a couple of lines or a sentence. You can add a lot more to it. It's an opportunity to learn, take advantage of it. So the first few times I gave this talk, I just left this slide as assume positive intent. I have since changed that. This comes with a very huge disclaimer. If you are getting code reviews on open source projects, if you're getting code reviews by strangers, even if you're getting a code review by somebody on your team that you really feel like you trust, assuming positive intent can be really difficult, and I think it's okay to still call somebody out when they've had a negative impact on you, right? So the individual who gave me the LOL what comment, we ended up having a conversation about that because I was like, oh, that broke my heart. And of course, that wasn't the intent at all. That was not his intention. But it still had an impact on me that we really have to talk about. So assume positive intent with your teammates. Do it with a disclaimer. Still hold people accountable to interacting respectfully. Trust your teammates. Be respectful. Be humble. Another reason why assuming positive intent also has a disclaimer is because we all have bias. And when we're reviewing code, we're going to have bias, of course. For me personally, I discovered this at Sports Engine where I work now. If I ever reviewed somebody's code who I perceived to be more senior, they didn't even have to be, I just perceived them to be more senior than somebody I perceived to be more early career or junior, I would give them a whole lot less comments. My code reviews were maybe a third of the number of comments that I would give to somebody who's early career. I think it's okay to adapt your communication style, the kinds of things that you're going to bring up based on whose code it is, but I realized that that was just because of a bias I had. It wasn't because I was trying to adapt my communication style. I was more intimidated by those I perceived to be more senior. There's a number of studies that even show, especially in open source communities, the impacts of having a name that people assume is a woman versus a name that people assume is a man. When names were revealed, women were a lot less likely to get their pull requests just merged in. As soon as the names were hidden, women were more likely to get their pull requests merged in. I can share some of these studies with you afterwards. I don't have a good solution for bias. I feel like I'm still really working to figure out how to deal with my more senior bias. But I do want to talk about it. I want you to work to identify your own and understand where yours is coming from and consciously combat it, especially when you're reviewing code. Finally, I recommend that you have really high expectations for conduct. If you're bringing code reviews to your team, if you're already doing code reviews on your team, it's never too late to start talking about conduct with how you treat one another. Actually write a code of conduct. We just went through this process at Sports Engine. We're writing a code of conduct for our actual code reviews. We have things in there like don't do self-deprecation. That happens a ton where people are like, oh, I'm so stupid, that was dumb, when they made that mistake. But what does that do? That means the next person who sees that and they made that same mistake, they now assume that they are stupid or so dumb. So we had to call out things like self-deprecation in our code of conduct when we see some of these habits. Hold each other accountable, call each other out when somebody actually violates your code of conduct. The code of conduct is going to exist as a tool, so you can point out when somebody has violated it. I used to also try to remind folks that code reviews are all about making code better. I actually don't believe that anymore. I don't think that's the right part to be focusing on. I think it's really about empowering one another to write really great code. This is a deeply human thing. This is less about the code itself and more about trying to get better as engineers and working with each other to do so. So if you don't do code reviews yet, if you're nervous to do them, I'd recommend just giving it a try. do just a spontaneous code review. Maybe somebody here at the conference while you're here for the next 3 days. You can have a spontaneous code review like that. That's all I got. Thank you all for coming.